Howdy, everyone. For today's Jolly Lark, we're going to be doing a speed painting showdown where we take 3 models, all Gloomspite Gitz by Games Workshop, prepared in 3 different ways, and see which one is the fastest and which one looks the best when speed painted. The Gitz are great for this because there's not tons and tons of details, so I can show you a few different techniques without going too deep in the weeds on bits and bobs and pouches and ropes and stuff like that. So the 3 we've got here is we've got a classic model primed white. We've got a zenithal primed with a secret right here. So white over black plus a secret. And we got your classic black primer right here, right? All right, so what's that secret of the middle one? The secret of the middle one is that before, what you can kind of see here is that before priming putting the white on, so I started with black, I painted the hands in a blue, kind of like so. So you can see on this model here, the hands and the face have been painted kind of a medium blue. And what that'll do is make the shadows on the greens not quite so bright, or rather not quite so dark. So the shadows on the black won't be quite so dark. And what we'll then do is you can start with this, then add a little bit of white primer. You end up with something that has the benefits of zenithal, but has a little more differentiation in the shadows, so that the shadows on the skin aren't exactly the same thing as the shadows on the black cloak, which will in turn make the shadows of the black cloak look darker. So let's pull out some paints and get started. With this video, what I did is paint all the models kind of at the same time. I bounced back and forth between them a little bit, but I'm going to edit the video to show the step-by-step process for each different model. That way, if you want to follow along, you can just skip to the style of undercoating, whether or not that's white, black, or zenithal primer, and have a clear step-by-step. It seemed a little confusing if I was bouncing around between the models. So we're going to begin with the white primed goblin. I'm starting off with the Citadel Contrast Paint Rattling Grime, which is my new go-to contrast paint for painting black. Over a white primer, it creates okay highlights, a pretty good differentiation between the highlights and the shadows. I don't love contrast paints for cloth. I just feel like there's not quite enough texture there often for the contrast paint to really grab onto. And if you really go slow and steady, you can get a good result with it and just make sure that the paint isn't pooling up on the flat surfaces. But then I feel like it kind of defeats the purpose of some of the speediness of contrast paints. The other thing you need to be careful of when you're using contrast paints on a white undercoat is that you usually want to leave the parts, the different colors of the model, white until you get to them. So it means needing to be a little bit more careful about where to apply the black contrast paint, because you don't want to get black contrast paint on the goblin's face, for example, which is another way in which it's just a little slower to go on top of white primer. Now, sometimes, like for the shield that I'm planning to paint a rusty metal, it actually is useful to go over the shield with the black contrast paint so that you get the black in the cracks and crevices, and that'll make painting it metal easier later, because the metal paints don't always work great over white. So zooming in a little bit, you can see on the robes, I think this looks okay. You're getting some darker darks in the recesses, getting some lighter lights on the raised portions. But I think this would be I think all of these, I'll just say this, I think all of these would be fine. I think a painted army is always going to look good on the tabletop if it's cohesively painted. And any of these would be fine. So it might be worth doing a little showdown of your own and just see which one feels better to you. Because none of these results are bad. They would all look just fine as a big, fully painted army project. Next, I'm going to put a little bit of Vallejo chainmail onto the shield. With the black already on the shield, you don't have to be too careful about getting the silver into all the cracks and crevices. Just a quick swipe with silver over the shield will get that ready for a little bit of rust effects later on. This model, instead of the little handmade wooden swords, has a club with a spike in it, so a little bit of metal there, and you're good to go. So next up for the white primed goblin is a little bit of snakebite leather on the shoes. Putting a second coat on there because I forgot to record the first coat. So just to kind of keep my timekeeping correct, I'm curious to see how long each of these takes to paint. That's part of the showdown. So I'm going to give a quick slap of an extra coat of paint on the shoes and on the stick here. But this is both with the snakebite leather and speed painting. It helps to use the same colors in multiple places. And even if it's not quite as realistic, I think can make the army look a little more cohesive with a more limited color palette. The snakebite leather is a great yellowy wood color. I also use this Scale 75 Ink Tense wood in a lot of my models, but the snakebite leather works great too. Next up, I've got just a little bit of the Pro Acryl Bright Ivory. I'm going to put just a speck of this on the edges of his face, on the bridge of the goblin's nose, on the kind of point of his chin, and I'm going to touch up the belt just a little bit where I got some of the black paint, black contrast paint on the belt area, which is something you can always do if you I warned earlier about getting the black paint on areas you want to leave white, but you can always just touch it up with a little bit of white paint. The Pro Acryl Ivory cover is great and is good for that. So yep. That just brightens up the highlights on the green skin a little bit there. Looking good. Once the metal paint is dry, I'm going to grab a little bit of this dark rust wash from Vallejo's Mecha range and just put a little bit of this rust effect paint, kind of a thin, translucent, dark red onto the metal parts of the shield. Just kind of giving that a wash all over. It'll naturally settle a little bit, and it's a quick, easy way to do a little bit of a rust effect. A little bit of rust on the weapon too, and that'll do it. So I painted the bases kind of a brown black from Pro Acryl off camera, and one disadvantage of the white base is it does take an extra coat to fully cover up the white primer on the base, whereas the bases that are primed black, it's very quick and easy to paint them some other color. So here we are in Model 2. Now we've got the model that was zenithal primed, white over black. We've got the coat of green on the skin and the brown on the shoes, just like we did before. Putting a little bit of the silver on the shield. And we're putting the silver on the shield first, and then following that up with a coat of rattling grime over the zenithal shading, because the white primer over the black, it's still much too light for wanting to have even a faded black cloth. I really was going for speed painting here, and as you can see, the rattling grime goes on pretty dark. You don't get some of the pooling effects that you do going straight over the white primer, but it's darkening this up a lot and really losing a lot of the zenithal effect. Now, it's obviously faster to paint straight out of the bottle than it is to at all mix your colors. I think that if you wanted to preserve more of the zenithal effect at the expense of slowing down your painting a little, you might be better off here diluting the black grime contrast paint with a little bit of contrast medium or even just water. That would help preserve a little bit more of the zenithal highlighting than we're getting here, while still being pretty quick. So with these robes done, let me grab model number 1 that was primed white, and we can do a little side by side. So this is model number 1, model number 2, and you can see here that model number 2, that was the zenithal over the black primer, it is a lot darker. You can't fully see the effect yet because the paint's still wet on the one on the right, but I'll leave that up to you which one you prefer. I think maybe somewhere in the middle might be the right call. All right, I'm going to put a little bit of a snakebite leather on the rope belt of this one. And we try to leave that white during the contrast painting stage, but you've got a little bit of black on it, not the end of the world. Like with the white primed model, using the same colors for multiple steps speeds things up. So I'm going to go ahead and just use the snakebite leather for the wood as well. For his sword, these little swords I made out of styrene, just because I thought it'd make goblins be even sillier still. And you can see, I haven't mentioned this yet, I'm a little bit of self-promotion. These are the handles that I manufacture and sell, the Jolly Lark painting handles. One of the things I really like about them, like you just saw, is the ability to easily and comfortably hold them upside down. holding the miniature right side up isn't always the best angle. So really nice to be able to flip the model around, spin it around easily with the handles. So we're going to do the same rust effect on the shields, which has been already painted silver, just like we did on model number 1. We're going to try to keep the details on these relatively similar to make the side-by-side at the end a little more comparing apples to apples. All right, now let's grab model number 3. This is the model that started off just primed black. And what I'm going to do is give this just a pretty light touch dry brush with the Pro Acryl Bright Warm Gray, just trying to hit the raised edges of the face and the hood and the creases. I'm using the smooshing brush from Rosemary & Company, which is one of my favorite dry brushes. Plus, it has a fun name to say, the smooshing brush. Basically, just kind of a big, fat, soft brush that's got a rounded tip and is really great for dry brushing. So I'm giving this a pretty good layer of light gray. One of the things that's nice about dry brushing compared to airbrushing is you can really get it right where you want it. With dry brushing, I find that I'm much less likely to miss a spot or, put too much on. It just feels to me a little more controllable. Maybe that's because I'm wearing my magnifying glasses when I'm dry brushing and I'm not wearing my magnifying glasses when I'm airbrushing. But I'll leave that up to you. So this one is going to be a little more different than the previous two because we're not necessarily relying on contrast paints over a lighter undercoat quite so much. For the skin, I'm taking the Pro Acryl Yellow Green as a base coat and then grabbing a paler green color to use as the highlight. Not exactly blending here, but I am putting on the base coat first and then immediately grabbing the lighter color to add a highlight while the base coat is still wet. Not really spending much time blending per se, but you will get a little bit of accidental blending, speed paint blending, by putting on the base coat and the highlight at the same time. Pro Acryl paints are great for this because they have pretty good coverage. Vallejo Game Color works well for this because they have good coverage too. That can be a little hard to do with craft paints or cheaper paints because you don't quite have the coverage and you need to put the base coat on and then let it dry and then put it on again and then put the highlight color on. But if you're working with a good quality paint, you should be able to kind of base coat and highlight at the same time. And then I'm going to take a little bit more of the pale green and really accentuate the angles of the face and the very top of the hand. These goblins are really tiny. I mean, they're still the same 28, 30 millimeter scale that other GW models are, but they're half the height of a human. And when you're painting for tabletop play and you're painting an army, not a single model, you really want the details of the model to pop out from a couple of feet away, and nice bright highlights really help do that. I think this combination of pale green and the green yellow color, I actually really dig this as a goblin skin color. I think that looks good. I'm already liking how the dry brushing looks on the robes too. For the shoes on this goblin, since they're starting out black, we're not using contrast paints again. I'll stop saying that after this step. We're going to use a little bit of the Pro Acryl Light Umber. It's a great kind of neutral brown color for the shoes. And just put a little swipe of that on both shoes to brighten that out and make the goblins' kind of goofy feet stick out a bit more. Something you might find if you've been starting in the hobby since contrast colors were introduced and you're used to painting with contrast colors, I'd encourage you to give painting over a black primer a try. Blocking in the colors over black, leaving a little bit of the black in between the areas of color really makes for a fun kind of comic cartoony painting style that used to be the norm before contrast paints were introduced. So if you haven't tried painting over black, give it a whirl. So next up for the rope belt, I'm going to grab some of the golden brown. This is one of my go-to colors from the Pro Acryl range. It has really great coverage, even though it's a yellowy brown. It really covers the black nicely. And I'm just using a nice thin brush for this that has a good point, and just a quick swipe of the golden brown over the rope. Not too much paint on the brush, not too heavy a hand with the bristles. Just kind of give it a light stroke there to make the belt pop. And the belt does a lot of work to break up the robes on the goblin, so it's nice to get that right. Like the first two, I'm going to give the shield a quick swipe of silver. Because we're working over black here, a little bit like the second one where we had already given the shield a layer of black contrast, you can be kind of messy with this. Just you'll get the silver on the raised surfaces, kind of a wet brushing. You've got a decent amount of paint on the brush, but you're not trying to give it an even coat. Because if some of the black in the cracks is still there when you're all said and done, that's totally fine. Now, on this one that started black, the wood of the sword got a lot lighter during the dry brushing stage. I made sure to really dry brush the sword pretty heavily, but I still want the edges of the sword to be a little bit brighter before we add any brown to it. I'm just grabbing a little bit of the bright ivory and kind of touching the edges of the sword. Just give a little extra layer of highlighting to the wood of the sword and put it on in kind of a vertical, streaky sort of way to emphasize the wood grain. And then, because we're doing this pretty quick, I've still got the light umber on my palette paper there, and I've got the ivory, so I'm just going to mix all of those two together a little bit to make a little bit lighter brown, which is something you can do. Just kind of pay attention to what's still wet in front of you and use that lighter brown to create a quick highlight for the fronts of the shoes. And with the idea that it's going to look like kind of rugged, scuffed leather, and like I said, with the highlighting the chin and the nose, wanting kind of sharp highlights. Putting a nice sharp highlight of a light brown on the cap, tips of the shoes works well. Now, some things contrast paint just works great for. So I'm going to grab the same pot of snakebite leather contrast paint and use that on the wood of the sword. When you're trying to get an army project done pretty quickly, you don't want to be too beholden to any rules you've set for yourself. So we've mostly painted this model without contrast paint, but I just really like the look of the snakebite leather for wood. And trying to give it kind of a scuffed look where it's fading towards the tip a little bit. See him kind of paint some on, rub it off with my finger, paint a little more on, rub it off with the brush, paint a little more on. It's, just kind of get a little bit more of a gradient from the base of the sword and have it get a little bit lighter up to the tip. While I've got the snakebite leather out, add a little bit of water to a brush full of it. And then you can use that to shade the rope belt to put kind of create a little quick brown wash to go over the rope belt and make the threads of that rope stand out just a little bit better. So whenever you're speed painting, it's just nice to look for opportunities to use paint that's already wet on the palette in front of you. You can do the same thing with the shoes there. That little bit of thin down brown over the highlighted leather kind of pulls that bright highlight and the base coat of the brown together. Just like the first two, a little bit of the mecha dark rust on the metal of the shield to rough that up and add a little bit of color. All right, and here we have our three goblins. You probably can tell which is which, but I've mixed up the order a little bit. I put my favorite in the winner's position in the middle, which is starting with the black primer. I actually was a little surprised. I thought I was going to like the zenithal primed one better, but I kind of like how those robes turned out just with the dry brushed gray. I feel like it has a better black robe effect than either of the other two. Now, this is all with like the big old asterisk caveat that I was trying to paint these really fast. This is 3 models painted in about 15 minutes, which is a little bit slower because I'm recording everything. I can see that I missed a little spot on the wood club there on the one on the left. I've still got some snakebite leather out on my palette. Just boop, touch that up a little bit. And all right, back to it. So yeah, I mean, side by side, all of these could be improved upon, but none of these took more than about 5 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes a model. These are fast. The bases aren't quite done. You can season to taste there. I think any of these 3 techniques would look great as an army on the table, but of the 3, I think that middle one's the winner, which was just the starting with black and then dry brushing the robes and painting the shoes and the skin a little more traditionally with opaque paints over a black primer rather than contrast paints over a light or zenithal primer. So with the winning model here, I'm just going to take it a little bit further and show you the difference here. I'm going to take a little bit of a bright red. This is from the Too Thin Coats range of paints, but any bright red would do. I'm just going to dot the eyes with a little teeny dot of red. Goblin eyes are easier because they're just all red, which is nice. And then to kind of blend things together and add a little bit of shading, I'm going to grab some classic Nuln oil, put a little bit of wash of Nuln oil in the goblin's mouth to darken up the area between their teeth, put a little Nuln oil on the bottom skirts just to blend the dry brush highlights in a little bit, darken the shadows just a little bit, and provide a little extra shading. You can see that the highlights still stay pretty bright, but it just kind of pulls everything together. It actually won't look quite so dark when it's dry, but I think it looks good, and you can leave the top highlights as bright as they were. It is something to remember when working with the washes. They tend to look a little bit darker when they're wet than when they dry. And they've got a good bit of working times. You can see here on the hood, I'm putting some Nuln oil around the base of the hood, but then kind of rinsing my brush off and spreading it out so there's not any Nuln oil on the tip of the cap. A little bit of Nuln oil kind of on the bottom half of the shield provides a little bit of extra shading to the details of the shield there. Like so, just kind of not all over, but just kind of on the bottom half of things, bottom half of the robes, bottom half of the shield. And the other thing I wanted to do that I saw is if like the wood of the sword didn't quite turn out as well as I wanted, so I'm going to give it a light dry brush on the edges with the Pro Acryl Red Gray, which I think is a nice wood highlight color. Just brings out the texture just a little bit more than the wash alone did. And with the same idea as the robes, I'm going to grab a little bit of the orc flesh wash from the 2 thin coats range, but any kind of darker green wash would do it, and just add a little bit more definition to the skin, just very lightly. I'm not flooding the area, but in between the fingers, underneath the bottom lip, maybe a little bit in the eye sockets, and kind of the cheekbones. So a teeny little touch of a darker green wash in the cracks and crevices of the skin. Just make that skin pop a little bit more. All right, finish up the base real quick. Got a little bit of dirt on the robes. And there we have it. So with just another couple minutes, 3 or 4 more minutes on this model, I think it's taken it up a notch or two. And I'd be totally happy to field 40 of these little green guys on the table. I think this is a great looking little speed painted model. Now, 8 or 9 minutes a model times 40 is still a pretty good chunk of time to be painting. But these will be fun to get onto the table and send a horde of goblins headed the other way. So if you thought this was useful, I'd be curious. Let me know. Think this could be fun to do with other models from other ranges. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. As usual, check out links below order your handles. And we'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.